Welcome to part 2 of our current series where we're looking at the life of King David, arguably ancient Israel's greatest king. And last week we looked at how David had placed his trust in God and that saw him through tough and incredible battles in his life. And this week we're going to see that David suffered spiritual highs and lows just like we do. You know, when you have one of those giant killing moments like David did with Goliath, and where spiritually there is nothing that's going to beat it, and you feel so close to God, when you feel the joy of putting our complete trust in him. And quite often we feel that life with God should be like that all the time. And maybe you are thinking, yes, why can't my life be like that? Or maybe you're thinking, I never have experiences like that. Or maybe you can go from spiritual high to right down low really quickly, and it takes a while to get back up again. Today we're going to look once again through David's life, how he, like us, experienced the same thing, and then look at what we can do about it so our faith doesn't get killed off by these giants that we come across in life. The killer giants that I'm talking about, and I'm sure you'll recognise from your own life today, are anger, isolation and fear. These three conditions have the power to undermine the resolve of even the most dedicated, devout and disciplined among us. They can cause us to crash through every moral and ethical boundary we've set for ourselves. And if we're honest, these three killer giants have contributed to our greatest regrets, and I'm pretty sure they will be part of any future regrets. And the reason is this: when we're overwhelmed with the emotions associated with any of these conditions, we feel compelled to do something, anything to relieve the tension they create in us. The problem is we're creatures of habit, and when we get angry, feel isolated, or we're afraid, we rely on our instinct. We do what we did last time this happened, or we do what we feel worked before, or just what comes naturally. And as a result of that, things don't get better, things generally get worse. There's not less regret, there's more regret. Things aren't less complicated, and we end up angrier, and we end up lonelier, and we end up scareder. Now to the story of David. David had two colossal failures in his life. One he's very famous for, and that happened in his 50s once he'd become king. But the one we're going to talk about today takes place when he was in his 20s. This is the colossal mess up that he's not so famous for, but it's one of the most interesting, one of the most dramatic stories in all of the Old Testament. Following his defeat of Goliath, the message that we looked at last week, which is available on YouTube and Facebook if you missed it, David becomes the most famous person in Israel. He was a 15-year-old and everybody knew his name. He had become a legend. And King Saul, who was very happy for him to go and try and beat Goliath and ecstatic when he did, but now he's a bit concerned. The king realises that David has a lot of potential, and now suddenly he has a lot of influence and a lot of power as well. And King Saul was Israel's first king, and he was also extraordinarily insecure. So King Saul came up with a plan that might have been a good plan if David hadn't been who David was. He decided to get David into his family so he could control him. And he offers up one of his daughters to David in marriage. And David's response is really interesting. He says, I'm not worthy to be the king's son-in-law, and my family's not a famous family or a rich family, so I don't think I'm worthy. Following the story again in 1 Samuel. And Saul continues to find ways to control and ultimately have David killed without much success. And eventually one of Saul's daughters does fall in love with David, and after a thoughtful gift of 100 Philistine foreskins, David and Micah marry. And to make matters worse, Jonathan, Saul's son, is also great friends with David, and Saul becomes consumed with hatred over how much everyone loves David. And King Saul is very, very jealous. Well, time goes by, and for about 7 years, David swings between being in or out of King's favour. And on several occasions, King Saul would send David off on these impossible missions, but David would come back alive and successful, and people loved him even more. And so this escalated to the point that King Saul had finally had enough, and he discovers that every time he tries to have David secretly arrested, that his own son Jonathan, or his own daughter who married David, assists him. And he continues to slip between King Saul's fingers, and the frustration builds and builds and builds and builds. And finally, it all culminates one night at dinner. Now, dinner with the king was a big deal. Dinner was the big meal of the day in ancient times, and if you sat or ate at the king's table, that was an extraordinary honour. And David had typically shown up for dinner, but during these last few turbulent years, David kept missing dinner. And every once in a while, King Saul would say to Jonathan, "Where's David?" And Jonathan would cover him and go, "Well, I think he's out doing this or he's doing that." So finally, one night at dinner, the whole family is gathered around and King Saul loses it and he just explodes. And here's what the text tells us from 1 Samuel chapter 20. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die." Saul has had it, and he feels that his whole family is conspiring against him. Saul wanted his son Jonathan to be the next king, and he could see it all slipping away. He sees his family, not David's, as part of the future of Israel. Jonathan finds and warns David, and he tells him to leave to save his life. David is only 22 and he's the hero of the country. He loves his life and he's being successful in all that he does. You'd think he'd want to be riding the top of that spiritual wave, but David is feeling rejected. Rejected by the king and the country he rules over, a country that he's risked his life for over and over again. And in this particular case, he's done nothing wrong. So he's abandoned and he's angry and he's afraid. And he did what many of us do when we're abandoned, angry and afraid. He panicked and he decided to take matters into his own hands. And he lost sight of something that last week was hard for us to imagine. He'd lost sight of the fact that God was with him. Because when you read these stories, when you read these narratives and we know how the story ends, it's so hard to imagine being David in that moment as he faces these killer giants of anger, fear and isolation. And we still wonder, why would David make a decision like that? Why would he panic? Why would he run? Why would he abandon his morals? Why would he abandon his ethics? And I can't help but think there are people who are watching us right now, watching you right now, and they're wondering the same thing. There are people who are watching us right now as we struggle with some of the things that we face today, the same things, wondering the same thing. Why would you do that? In fact, let's be honest. We can all look back on our past with hindsight and ask ourselves, why would I do that? Why would I go there? Why would I call him back? Why would I say yes to that invitation? Why did I spend that money? Why did I borrow that money? What was going on was actually really simple, because when we feel abandoned, angry and afraid, our natural inclination is to panic. And that's what David did. So here's what happened. The text tells us that David went to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. And perhaps a little context will help with the story. In the time in history that we're looking at, Israel did not own the city of Jerusalem, so there wasn't really a capital city. So the life and worship of God happened wherever the tabernacle was, or the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant, or the tabernacle, would be moved around from city to city to the safest place within the territory that Israel controlled. And at this particular time, it was in a city named Nob. And because the tabernacle was there, the priests were there, and Ahimelech was there, who was the high priest. David shows up, and Ahimelech trembled when he met him, and he asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" Because every time David showed up, you heard him coming before he even got there, because he always travelled with about 1,000 personal warriors. And Ahimelech had never seen David by himself, and suddenly David shows up on his own. And he's a little nervous. And Ahimelech's looking around thinking, okay, what's going on? And David answered Ahimelech by lying. And this is the beginning of the slippery slope for David, because he is so against lying, because he loves God's law. And at this moment, he's speaking to the high priest. He is in the presence of the original version of the Ten Commandments. David is against lying, but David lies. And in 1 Samuel 21, it tells us, David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. And as for my men, I've told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find.'" Why is he lying? Because he's afraid. And when you're afraid or angry and you're abandoned, we forget the ways of God. That was just so lame, but he's just trying to cover for himself. He didn't have any men, and he's afraid that if he tells the truth, Amalek isn't going to help him. And that lie would cost not David, but Amalek and his entire family their lives, as we see later. But the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here. Every Sabbath, the priest would bake fresh bread and they would put it on the altar before the Lord. And it might say strange to us, but this is their way of honouring God with fresh bread. And later, only those that were ceremonially clean, usually the priests, could eat the bread. But David was not ceremonially clean and he wasn't a priest. So David has not only lied why he's there, now he's lied in order to be fed, which if you were here last week or you heard the first part of this series, you have to begin to wonder what happened to you, to the David who said, in you I put my trust. My hope is in you all day long. That in God you are my refuge and I run to you in times of trouble. What happened to that version of David? David had forgotten that what God has the power to arrange, he has the power to sustain. And then the story gets so intense. There's so much drama in this next part. And I'm really hoping that in the drama of this next moment, that maybe God would speak to you. Because David asks Amalek, do you have a spear or a sword here? Amalek gets a big clue now. What's going on here? You're like the most famous warrior in the nation and you show up by yourself. You look like you haven't slept in days. You don't have any food and you don't even have a weapon. And then David is virtually transported back in time to the very event God used to catapult him into fame. This is the wake-up call moment. This is the, oh my gosh, what am I thinking? Why am I thinking this way? Why am I doing this? Why am I even considering these options? This is that moment for David. This is the moment when his eyes should have been opened because the priest replied, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed 7 years ago in the valley of Elah, is here. And the text in between last week's message and today's message tells us that when David beheaded Goliath, he kept the sword as a souvenir. And he took the sword of Goliath and he dedicated it to God and gave it to the high priest to keep, to recognise that it had been God's power that had beaten Goliath and not his own. The sword was great symbolism for how much David trusted God. That sword and all those memories would come flooding back. The afternoon that he wandered down into the valley of Elah all by himself as a shepherd boy with nothing but a sling. Thousands of men lined up on both sides of the valley and he stood in front of a giant. What happened to that clear-eyed, courageous, God-fearing shepherd boy who looked at a giant, a battle-hardened warrior and said, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. What happened to the boy that ran towards danger as opposed to away from it? What happened to the poet who wrote these famous words, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me? Where's that faith? Where's that confidence in God? And the answer is fear, anger, loneliness. We know this. These three giants have the potential to cause all of us to forget the defeated giants of our pasts. These three giants have the potential to undermine our faith in God, even when we're reminded of what God has done in the past. David gets shown a visual aid to remind him of God's faithfulness and God's power, and he misses it. And this would have been a decision that David would regret for the rest of his life, and it would become like all of our decisions too. It would become a permanent part of the story of his life. And David said when he heard about the sword, there is none like it, give it to me. When we need God the most, often that's the times we're least able to lean in his direction. When we need God the most, we're often tempted to run away rather than towards. We opt for things that never worked before and often lead to regret. And it's so interesting because you've seen this in other people. You have friends right now that are making terrible decisions based on anger, based on fear, and maybe based on a sense of being abandoned. You see it in them and you're thinking to yourself, you're just going to make it more complicated. You're just going to create more regret. It's so easy to see this in other people, but it's almost impossible to see this in the mirror. And here's why. Because you've convinced yourself, like I convinced myself, that my situation is different. You don't understand. And that's what David thought. He thought what we think. If God were with me, if God was really with me in this, this wouldn't be happening to me. It's so easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust him with and nothing to trust him for. It's so easy to say, God, I want to know your will for my life. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll surrender my life. And when things are going great, it's easy to sing worship songs. When things are great, it's easy to volunteer. And when things are going great, how easy it is to pray and pray for friends and family when things are good. It's easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust him with and nothing to trust him for. But it's harder to trust him when the things that we value start to slip away. So David takes Goliath's sword and he knows he has to leave the country, and guess where he goes? He goes to the land of the Philistines, obviously, with Goliath's sword. Not only does he go to the city of Gath, and guess who was from Gath? That's right, it was Goliath, but he's panicking and he's afraid, and so he goes to the Philistines and he goes to their leader and he says, I want to join your army. I want to fight for you against my own people. And the Philistines don't believe him. And David becomes really afraid because now he is surrounded by his enemies. So he does what every self-respecting human being would do. He pretends like he's insane. Literally. He starts scratching with his nails on wood. He stops slobbering all over. And eventually the leader goes, okay, I have enough fools in my court as it is. Get this guy out of here. So David flees the Philistines and he goes and he lives in a cave because he doesn't know what to do and he feels abandoned and he's angry and he's alone. When David was with Amalek looking for bread and looking for a weapon, there was someone else there as well, a guy called Doeg. And Doeg was actually the chief herdsman for King Saul. And he saw David there and he overheard the conversations and he got just enough information to go back and tell Saul, and made things really look bad for Amalek. He goes to King Saul and he says, King Saul, I have located David. I know where he is. He went to Amalek for advice, provisions, and he took the sword of Goliath. Saul then calls for Amalek, and King Saul said to them, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him? In other words, you're in on this. Why would you side against me, the king? My son's against me, my daughter's against me, my family's against me, and now the chief priest is against me. And Amalek answered the king, who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God of him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant of any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. But the king said, you will surely die, Amalek, you and your whole family. King Saul is so crazy, paranoid, and he orders the guards to kill all the priests of the Lord. But the king's officials were unwilling to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. The king then ordered Doeg, you turn and strike down the priest. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck them down. And that day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, and its cattle, donkeys and sheep. Very few people escape the slaughter, but one that does is one of Amalek's sons. And he flees to David, falls down at his feet, and he tells David the entire story, and David is broken. And the text says that David said, I am responsible for the death of your entire family. David was responsible for the death of an entire village, because when we take matters into our own hands, it might feel good, but it just doesn't turn out good. Let's consider some questions to help us think about our own lives. There's going to be a time in all of our lives when our anger pushes us to do the things we know we shouldn't do, or our sense of isolation and loneliness suddenly has us fantasizing about things that we would tell other people they have no business doing. Somehow these things and ideas becomes options for us because these emotions are so powerful. So here's the questions. What is your loneliness, anger or fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? relationally, financially, physically, some sort of risk you would never take before. Maybe the idea of re-embracing an old habit that you spent hours and hours or days or weeks or possibly years and money overcoming. And suddenly you find yourself rethinking embracing that habit. How about this question? Who is your loneliness, anger or fear causing you to consider that you shouldn't consider? You've never called him back, but you're thinking about calling him back now. You didn't return that call, but you're now thinking about calling her back now. She's made it very obvious, he's made it very obvious that there's a potential for a relationship, and you've ignored it and ignored it, ignored it. But now, because of what's going on financially, because of what's going on in some other area of your life, suddenly that's a real option for you right now. And you know you have no business doing that. And here is the wake-up call question. This is the question that David completely missed. He was 22 years old and by himself, but this was the wake-up call question that I hope will be your wake-up call. Who besides you does your considerations put at risk? Who besides you do these options risks besides you? And I know you already know the answer to that question, because the answer is the people that you love and who love you the most. Some of you know that through personal experience with your family growing up, because dad's anger spun out of control and you've been dealing with that ever since, or mum's depression or mum's sense of loneliness or abandonment just got out of control and she turned to things, and you've been dealing with that ever since as a son or a daughter. Who else is at risk? Who else's future hangs in the balance of your personal decision to give in to the impulse created by anger, abandonment or fear? And one last question. What advice would you give? What advice would you give someone who is you? What would you tell yourself? And isn't it true when it's someone else, it's so clear, but when it's us, we all think we're an exception to the rule? Did you know you're not an exception to the rule? You're a very unique person, but your experience is not unique. You're a very special person, but your experience is not special. You're one of a kind person, but your experience is not one of a kind. These are well-worn paths. That's why it's easy to know what other people ought to do. Now, the interesting thing about this question is that now we know the advice that David would give us. Not just the 20-year-old David, but grown-up King David. And he later gave this advice. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. Not a chemical, not alcohol, not an affair, not hurting ourselves or another person, not a lot of debt, not a new car, not a new house or something else that you can list. The Lord is a refuge. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. And David would said, I took refuge in my ability to control outcomes, and the outcome was a disaster. He would say, but I was mistaken. I thought I had been forsaken. I thought this wouldn't be happening to me if God was with me. I felt forsaken, but now looking back, I realised that I wasn't. God was with me. I was mistaken. You know what he would tell you? He would say, don't make that mistake. 1,000 years after this event, David's most famous descendant, who was actually born in the city of David, would gaze into the eyes of some frightened, angry, abandoned, overtaxed Israelites, and he would say, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, my burden, and my perspective, my worldview. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Because when you feel forsaken, you are mistaken. God is with you. That's what Jesus would say. That's what David would tell us. And he would say, don't run. Don't run. When Amalek brought out the sword of Goliath, that's when I should have remembered. That's when I should have leaned into God instead of running away from him. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. But it's even better than that. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. He is your stronghold in times of trouble. And more of that next week as we look at what we can learn from the life of David. So before I go, let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you never leave us. You are always with us. You never forsake us. And even when we feel alone, your compassion is not exhausted. So come, Lord Jesus, will you comfort us with your joy, with your embrace. that we may know when those wake-up calls come. In Jesus' name, amen. Remember, you're not alone. If you need to get in touch and talk to somebody, then please do get in touch. But for now, let's learn from the life of David and let's not have regrets as we come out of this pandemic. God bless and go in peace.